Hi, everybody. I just want to do a sort of quick overview of the readings and videos for this week. I'll be doing this for the next 5 weeks because we're getting into more of the content areas of the course for sure. There's a short introductory, well, actually, a long introductory chapter to McCrum et al. The story of English, and I don't want to spend like a lot of time on it, but I do want to go over some of the sort of key ideas that I see coming up in there. On page 13, they start talking about the Education Act of 1870, and I want to clarify. I mean, it says this in the book, but I mean, just clarify that this is the Education Act of British Parliament that's taking place in Victorian England. But and they allude to this in the book. You know, there are similar initiatives happening in the United States, but they're not at the sort of federal level like they are in England. So you have a lot of reform going on. This is really important because, and actually harkens back to a discussion we were having on Discord, I think in the graduate channel, about literacy rates, that it is well worth thinking about for this class that it's only in the 19th century that industrialized nations like the United Kingdom and the United States go into majority literacy rates. I mean, that for most of human history, a minority of people were actually able to read and write. And so that as we talk about language, it's worthwhile remembering that the modern study of linguistics is really about speech, and that reading and writing historically is this kind of epiphenomenon. I mean, it's just this sort of side thing that happens, even though, of course, like in terms of political and economic and social power, it has this inordinate effect. But it is that the Education Reform Act of 1870, along with statewide initiatives that are taking place in the United States, are important to note in terms of that development. Um, on page 29, they make a really nice point that you can talk about the King's English or the Queen's English, but you can't talk about the President's English. And this, a lot of times when people talk about that the United States does not have social class in the way that Britain does, this is one of the things that they're referring to. That is an extremely deceptive claim, by the way, right? Because it implies that there's no economic disparity. But certainly, as we'll be talking about in later weeks, and this is why I'm bringing it up now, social class is encoded linguistically in very different and sort of more historically tenacious ways in Britain and in Europe generally than it is in the United States, where we've had just a lot more population shift over a short amount of time. On page 30, it already, this book is old, I know, and even the revised version we have goes back to 2002, but they claim that, sort of because of Hollywood, Valley Girl talk has a lot of social currency. I just don't see that, 22 years on down the road anymore. But I did want to point out that they also, in talking about sort of California and its impact on English, they do talk about Silicon Valley, and they, point to a lot of terminology, beginning with Googling, itself as a verb, that has arisen out of computer technology and the internet that is still with us. And so I thought that that was a valid, sort of important point to recognize. Finally, chapter 1 ends by making a really important point, which is that, it starts out by mentioning the fact that we're going to be coming back to English as a language is globally important in 2024. I mean, that is still the case. While there are more speakers of Chinese dialects and languages, just because of the sort of Asian landmass, basically, and the impact of the political and social impact of China, there are more nations around the world that have English as an official language than any other language. So I mean, it is and it obviously has a huge impact on the internet as well, as we're going to be talking about in week 6. That said, there's nothing special about English. You will sometimes hear people say that one of the reasons English is a global language is because it's easier to learn. Well, ask anybody who actually is a non-native speaker, and they'll tell you that's just not the case. English has as many weird aspects to it as any other language. We actually have a lot of bizarre idioms. We have syllabic R, which is actually really rare, and we'll be talking more about that in the coming weeks. We have really inconsistent spelling, and that goes back to stuff we'll be talking about next week. So there's nothing inherently special about the English language that makes it easier to learn or makes it better as a global lingua franca, as we say, as a sort of common tongue. It's just coincidence, historical coincidence, that you had a really powerful naval based empire, the British Empire, that was spreading English across the world from the late 18th century sort of through to the late 19th century. So for over a century, the British Empire is just, dominant globally. And then the language could have faded, but of course what happens then is in the early 20th century, it gets replaced by another English-speaking, now not political and military so much, but commercial empire of the United States. And so, we'll be talking more in later weeks about the impact of of Hollywood and commercialization, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, these brands that have kind of spread around the world, and the English language has gone with them. So that there's just a sort of coincidence, actually, that as British power waned, one of its former colonies, the United States, would actually sort of become itself a global power, and that has really, so across sort of like 3 centuries, English has just historically been important. It's not always going to be that way, by the way. You can't, but that's kind of where we're at now, and it is why simply having facility with English carries with it a certain amount of political and economic power. Moving on to chapter 2, which is really one of my favorite chapters. I mean, I teach this class essentially because I am a medieval literature professor, because that's kind of what my specialty is. We just note that English is an Indo-European language, and here I want to gesture towards the really great segment. The link that I have picks up in the middle of a video from Michael Wood's excellent Story of India that talks about the discovery of Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European as the sort of root language of many different languages. I mean, it's something like a third of all languages still spoken in the world can be traced back to Proto-Indo-European. English is one of those. It belongs to the West Germanic group of language, which itself is part of the broader Germanic group of languages. And then it is actually closely related to, and this is part of the big history that we're going to be talking about here, is closely related to Italic languages that include Latin and French, which is a Romance language, as well as Celtic languages, which of course geographically it is actually Celtic-speaking peoples who are there when Anglo-Saxon, Old English-speaking settlers and invaders arrive in about 410 AD, so in the Common Era, I should say. So in the early 5th century, and that's kind of a key, but it is precisely, they're actually linguistically closely related, which is why languages like Old Norse, which is itself a Germanic language, like French, which is a Romance language, and Latin, which is sort of the core of Romance languages, so easily influence English. It's sort of proof of language groups. That actually comes out, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here, that actually comes out on page 69 when you have Tom Shippey talking about the influence of Old Norse on Old English, and I actually link to it what I think is a really kind of delightful video where you have two modern scholars, one of Old Norse and one of Old English, carrying on a conversation with each other, showing how sort of like closely related these two languages are. An analogy that I've heard is the relationship between sort of Portuguese and Spanish, where it's like they're not technically, they're not the same language. They're not even dialects of the same language, but they become mutually intelligible enough. And that it's one of the things that happens is that they stop paying attention to inflectional endings, these root endings, because one of the things that comes out in the reading is the fact that Old English is a synthetic language that uses inflectional endings to define parts of speech. And this is where we now go back to those readings from linguistics on syntax and semantics that we did last week, where you know what the subject or an object of a sentence is based not on its position, but on the word ending. But if you start ignoring those endings because you're an Old Norse speaker trying to communicate with an Old English speaker, that actually hastens a process that was already underway right around the 10th and 11th centuries, which was the dropping of these inflectional endings, and English becomes an analytic language where it is actually case of nouns is determined by position, by syntax, and this is where we get our subject, verb, object, our modern syntactical structure of English. And so that's actually related to the fact, the overall sort of important point to process here is that's related to the fact that all of these languages are so closely related linguistically, all members of that of that Indo-European language family. When I reference Proto-Indo-European, by the way, that is the hypothetical language that we assume that all modern Indo-European languages have descended from. But of course, there's no written record of it. It is an entirely reconstructed language based on what the words must have sounded like, just to throw that in there really quickly. Just to back up a little bit on page 63, they give this list of church words and the importance of Latin and the influence of Latin on English. And it's actually something that there are multiple stages in which Latin influences English, but it's so crucially important because I do have to point out, and this is a little hard for people to wrap their head around sometimes, Latin was influencing English before it was spoken in England, right? Because Anglo-Saxon speakers immigrate to England from what is now northern Germany and northern Holland in the 5th century, like I mentioned. But before that, they're already coming into contact with Christian missionaries on the European continent. And so that's another sort of interesting reason why Latin has such a sort of lasting influence on English, and why, of course, any of you who have taken SATs or the GRE or something know that some even passing knowledge of Latin gets you a pretty long way in an English vocabulary test because a lot of our most multisyllabic words have Latin roots to them. So, and then I guess finally, so I've talked about, I don't want to, I'm sorry, not finally. We can't move on to Middle English without talking about the influence of 1066, the Battle of Hastings, and the Norman conquest. William I, William the Conqueror, coming in and claiming the crown of England. And the book talks a little bit about this history. We don't really actually have time to get into it too much in this class, but suffice to say that William was the Duke of Normandy, French-speaking, Norman French-speaking nobleman. He's able to amass this invasion army because he promises a lot of French nobility land in England. And one of the striking things, this isn't just about conquest, this is about political organization. One of the striking things about the Norman conquest is how ruthless and systematic William is about eliminating the English-speaking aristocracy. And, it's a good example. Top-down linguistic reform rarely works, but this does have a pretty major impact on the English language, because we get over 10,000 loanwords from Anglo-Norman and later Central French over the course of the Middle Ages, precisely because the Norman aristocrats are so thorough in making this sort of tier of society, so that after 1066 you have 3 languages being spoken in England. There's the Church Latin, which is a pretty significant portion of the population, by the way, becomes the sort of, again, lingua franca that everybody's speaking is Latin. French becomes the language of power. I mean, socially coded, it becomes the language that if you want to at all have any kind of political or military authority, you better know how to speak French. And then English, starting out as Old English, and then by the end of the period, it'll be Middle English, is the language of the commons. I mean, of 90% of the population. And so it is a good example of how that sort of, top down power can have influence. I mean, it's actually one of the reasons why in places like India and Singapore and some nations in Africa, English is still so broadly spoken. Yes, they see it as a colonial language, but they also see it as a sort of entree into getting opportunities, like job opportunities. And you have to see French as being much the same way in medieval England. All of that said, I have to stress the fact that, Middle English is not just a matter of Old English plus French. A lot of people get that impression. The fundamental Middle English does have like a ton of French loanwords in it, but the fundamental change that happens is something that I already referenced, which is the loss of inflections and changes in pronunciation, so that by the time you get to Middle English, you have a recognizable. A lot of the pronunciations are still different from modern English, and a lot of the words are still different from modern English, but the subject verb object syntax is there enough that, one of the most famous examples of Middle English, of course, is Geoffrey Chaucer. And you read Chaucer, and his sentence structure can fall into modern iambic pentameter poetic lines, precisely because he is mostly following the subject verb object word order. And then I do have, I'm linked to a video that talks about then, so how does Middle English reemerge from French? Well, it's again about politics, where any of you who have taken Shakespeare hopefully know the story of Henry Bolingbroke, who's going to become Henry IV. He is not raised as a French-speaking royal. He is the son of John of Gaunt and is largely a native English speaker, but also, and the video stresses that fact, and that's true, but also he has to appeal to common. He gets a lot of support from the commons as he basically takes about usurping King Richard II, and so because of that common support, it is in his it becomes in his best interest to start issuing proclamations in English, and so it's arguably the Lancasters' need for popular support from amongst the English commons that then brings English back into the sort of official status after about 1400, and from that point on, it just goes from there. The story's a little bit more complicated than that. Like, parliamentary proceedings actually start taking place in English again before Henry takes power, so he's just sort of riding a wave that's already happening, but the usurpation of Richard II and the reign of Henry IV absolutely reinstalls English as the official language of England again, after a centuries-long period where it was sort of competing with French and Latin. And so that's kind of the primary story that we're going to be reading and talking about on Discord this week. So I look forward to seeing your comments on the readings and the videos. See you soon.